Hey guys, welcome to part one of my interview with Dr. Will Cole. Today we're going to talk about processed foods and how they're carcinogenic. But are there some processed foods that are potentially okay for you? I think you're going to love this. Also, the best meat to eat for your health and what you believe will be patients who believe their diagnosis, succumb to their diagnosis. And there's a great story about one who believed it and didn't even have it. Stay tuned. So excited for this interview today. We'll start with our quote of the day. No one way of eating will be sustainable if you don't have a healthy relationship with yourself. That is from our guest today, Dr. Will Cole. So excited to have him back on the show. He is one of our faves, and I think you guys are going to love this two-part series. There's so many jaw-dropping moments in here, so many amazing takes on things that he has that just make you feel better about how you're eating and how you're living, and no extremes and not shaming yourself. So this is a good one, guys, or these are good ones. Okay, so for those who don't know Dr. Will, let me tell you a little bit about him. He's a leading functional medicine expert who consults with people around the globe. He was named one of the top 50 functional and integrative doctors in the nation. He provides a functional medicine approach for thyroid issues, autoimmune conditions, hormonal imbalances, brain problems, digestive disorders. He's also the popular host of the Art of Well-Being podcast and the New York Times bestselling author of Intuitive Fasting, Ketotorian, The Inflammation Spectrum and Gut Feelings, and also Healing the Shame-Fueled Relationship Between What You Eat and How You Feel. This is why he's so good at what he does, as I told you earlier. We're so glad to have him back here to talk to us a little bit about this documentary that I started watching, and it was based on his Instagram post. It's on Netflix, and it's a docuseries called You Are What You Eat. So we're going to dive into this documentary and its findings with you right now. First of all, I'm so happy to have you back on the show, and the catalyst for it was a post you had that just totally inspired me, and I was like, we got to do this again, and we got to talk about this series. Now, between travel, not having a kitchen, and a baby, I didn't get to see all of the series, but there's a documentary on Netflix that you posted about called You Are What You Eat. And it was pretty fascinating. They were doing this study on 21 sets of twins because twins have the same cells, the same DNA, and they put them each on a different diet. But it's funny because I was a little lost, Will. It kind of went into a lot of different places. And I also wasn't really clear on what they were trying to figure out. Was it just that a vegan diet is better than a meat diet? But then there was a lot of other things, but there was a lot that I learned. And maybe, you can tell me about what you thought of this documentary.
Yeah. So first of all, thanks for having me back. I appreciate it. And side note, this is completely stupid, but every time I talk to you or I hear your name, the Santana song comes in my head and I sing it in my head. Do you hear that a lot?
No, but I love it. But you know what? I've lived my life with people singing different Maria songs to me, so I'm not surprised.
For me, it's the Santana song.
I'm dead. That's so funny.
Well, I digress. So yeah, like you said, I think it was 22 pairs of twins, so 44 total people, and they followed them for 8 weeks. And for 4, they split them into 2 different groups. An omnivore group, meaning plant foods and meats, and a vegan group, just plant foods, for 8 weeks. They fed them the exact same food for 4 of those 8 weeks. And then the second 4 weeks of the 8 weeks, they just gave them guidelines to then feed themselves. They didn't have any caloric restriction. They just said, eat as much as you would normally eat, to not manipulate it too much over those 8 weeks. And I mean, the goal of it, I think the goal of the study was to see, how does a vegan diet perform over an omnivore diet? The problem is some unexplained variables, some confounding factors that the study had limited scope. as far as how we can extrapolate and use that data and what do we get out of it when it comes to the findings.
Well, I'm
But
also confused
yeah.
before you move on why they didn't, if they're trying to see, and they also were trying to see if the biological age could change versus the chronological age or vice versa. But
Mhm.
what's the point of we're going to make you eat the same thing, this diet for 4 weeks, and now you can do whatever you want. And over the course of 8 weeks, we're going to see what changes. I would think they'd have to eat the same thing over 8 weeks, like the appropriate
Mhm.
diet. Putting it in their hands halfway through didn't make any sense to me. So I was so confused.
Right. And, I think the interesting part of the study was the fact that these are twins, where they're genetically similar. And so the premise of the study, I, as a functional medicine practitioner, am very interested in the epigenetic genetic conversation and studies that centered around that. And the what they were doing over the first 4 weeks was to teach them this way of eating. And you're right. I mean, there's definitely a difference between what you're getting fed by researchers and doing it yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Surprisingly, they stuck with the protocol pretty well, but it certainly wasn't as standardized as the first 4 weeks. And they were looking at a few cardiometabolic markers, things that we run in functional medicine, things that are good evidence-based ways for you to gauge your metabolic health. And by that, I mean risk factors for heart attack and stroke, type 2 diabetes. You mentioned longevity, health span. I mean, all of this
Inflammation, probably, right?
inflammation. Yeah. They looked at things like HDL or good cholesterol, LDL or what is commonly oversimplified as bad cholesterol. They looked at weight. They looked at insulin levels. They looked at triglyceride, a lot of those markers. And what they found was over 8 weeks, there were some changes between the omnivores, those that ate meat and those that don't. The problem is the media and then the Netflix documentary really ran with overstating and exaggerating hyperbolic headlines and titles saying veganism is better and look, here's why. But that's not what the data showed. It's the research was too much limited in scope to say that. I mean, the real conclusion of the study was that amongst high carb diets, both were higher carb, that the vegan group lost more weight. They had they ate less calories as well compared to the omnivore group. They had lower LDL-C, low LDL-C or calculated, and lower insulin, just a little compared to the omnivore group, compared to the higher carb omnivore group. So then we run and say, well, veganism is best, but you really can't extrapolate that data and say with that because of the limited aspects of the study, because we don't know some nuance and context of it. I think one of the biggest thing that I would say here is that we don't know the body composition changes, which I wish the researchers would have done that.
Well, wasn't that the
Because
whole point of taking it in the first place?
well, yes, I don't know if they're going to release more data later, and maybe the data is not there. But at this point, it's not released at this point. But we don't know if there was muscle loss amongst the vegan group because we know as far as bioavailability of essential amino acids, the higher quality proteins generally going to come from meats. We don't know if the vegan group, their weight loss was due to some muscle loss, I think is something that we need to think about. And also LDL-C is the traditional way of measuring LDL-C, but it's especially amongst women, not a great indicator from a lab perspective. It's an incomplete perspective on if it's actually good or bad to lower LDL-C because it's about half of people who have heart attacks and strokes actually have normal to low cholesterol. So they should have ran, if they were asking me, running out the LDL-P, the particle sizes, which are these oxidized, inflammatory, small, dense LDL particles that do have a lot of evidence to show that the higher your small, dense LDL particles is increased likelihood of a chance of getting heart attack and stroke. They didn't look at that either. So there's a lot of limitations as to what we can use from that. So the headline is the true context of the study isn't as sexy and hyperbolic and clickbait worthy. And that's why they run with veganism. So that's kind of my hot take on it.
Got it. Well, let's go kind of back into what they were doing. It was a Stanford researcher scientist that wanted to see if the vegan diet was better, basically, right? Even though, like I
Yeah.
said, it was a little confusing. And I'm like, I'm a pretty bright person. And if I'm confused, I think that might be an issue, but whatever. Maybe I was a little distracted. I don't know. But they wanted to see what 8 weeks would do to change their health. They talked about how the meat and dairy industry was positioned in our country. They talked about how other countries were introduced after World War II to dairy and all kinds of things, and then their health all declined because of it. They also talked about this was kind of interesting. I was taking notes as I was watching, but the American, so this goes back to like what we all talk about, right? And I've always been a proponent of being the CEO of your health. And the reason we have to do that is because unfortunately, by the time they actually get to a place where they have to tell you the truth, it's already too late for so many. So with smoking, for example, the American Medical Association used to tell people that smoking was good for you. And I'm bringing this up because we need to remember things like this. We need to remember this to know when you're telling us to do something and we're like, oh, come on, Dr. Will, like, please, really? If it was a real
Mhm.
problem, like the World Health Organization would be telling us it is. But that's not true, guys. So the American Medical Association used to tell people that smoking was good for you. There were actually commercials that would say, what cigarettes does your doctor smoke? And they would boast that Camel cigarettes were the most smoked by doctors. Even though studies showed that this was terrible, it wasn't until 1964 where there was an overwhelming amount of studies called 7,000, let's call it. 7,000 studies came out. They had to accumulate before the Surgeon General would say, yeah, smoking is associated with cancer. And so they make the correlation now to the meat and dairy industry in a similar fashion where they haven't caught up. They haven't said this. The most they'll go to is say that saturated fat is bad for you and you want to have less than, I think, 10% of your diet be saturated fat. But what this documentary was sharing, so if we can stick to if we can go to some of the good stuff, was that, processed meat is the new cigarette. And that processed meat, cold cuts, hot dogs, bacon, all increase colon cancer. And they say that red meat is likely the same. I want to dig into that with you. So now processed meat, according to the World Health Organization, is a known human carcinogen, as bad or worse than cigarettes and asbestos. And all I could write in my notes was, ew, Subway, eek. And, they talk about how we can't wait for society to catch up on science because we need to really do that. So let's dig in a little bit into kind of the carcinogen world of processed meats and how bad it is and how much can we look the other way. Like if we're going to have breakfast with some bacon, I have occasional bacon. I now, hearing the word carcinogen connected to bacon, maybe I let that slide before, but now I'm done. And I'll tell you another reason I'm done is because I heard they're going to start pumping the COVID vaccine into pigs.
Not surprising. Not surprising. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the studies out there, we have to have a distinction between causation and correlation. I think that's a massive problem here because we have correlation or link to, and then headlines and media and special interests, depending on what those interests are, like to run with this sort of overstated hyperbolic takeaways, right? And a lot of the meat studies are done on processed meats, not high quality meat. That there's nobody in the wellness, clinical nutrition, functional medicine world that's going to say processed meat is good for you. But the problem is then when you put all red meat and all meat as a whole and lump it all together with processed meats, there's going to be disagreements amongst us within the nutrition world because it's, I would argue, what we've done to the meat, not the meat inherently itself. What is that animal being fed? How is that animal being treated? What are we injecting the animal with? What's the living conditions of the animal? And then we are what we eat in many ways when you talk about the title of that documentary. But in many ways, when you're looking at a CAFO hormone fed, grain fed cow versus a grass fed, organic, regenerative farmed cow, the outcome is going to be different. And I would argue, more studies need to be done to look at the difference. Let's look at the exciting science between the two. But to lump all meat together, that's where you have causation versus correlation. And also I would say this, when you look at even non-processed meats, the correlative aspect of many studies is that people that eat more meat tend to do a lot of other standard American things that aren't healthy, like smoking and drinking and not moving their body. So what is it? Is it the meat or the fact that they're drinking some alcohol or smoking or not moving their body? And then the headlines are red meat is linked to this. Well, there's a lot of other variables that we need to take into consideration with studies like that.
So break down causation versus correlation for people who are listening who are like, wait, what does this all mean?
The difference is something is correlated. We see a link. We know that people have, let's talk about meat as an example. People that eat meat, there's correlations with increased likelihood of heart attacks, stroke, cancers, things like that are looked at in the scientific literature. There's correlation there. But a true causal link saying, well, this is the mechanism of action. This is what happens when you have, and we know it's because the meat is the factor there. It's not the smoking. It's not the drinking. It's not the not exercising. It's the meat. There's no solid evidence showing that the correlated, the causative link. And it's harder to do, right? Because there's a lot of, when you talk about randomized controlled trials, placebo controlled trials, studies are very expensive, very long, and to find that link isn't easy to do. So most of the data is correlative data linking, and there's a lot of confounding variables.
Got it. So in your opinion, when you're treating your patients, red meat, you're okay with, processed meat, you're not?
Yeah, I would say that that's a fair statement. There's a lot of bioindividuality with that. Certainly, I'm not advocating anybody have processed meats. At the same time, I want to be a pragmatist and a realist for people. And we come up with a list of better for you options that may not be ideal. But someone could make the argument, and I don't know why I'm even doing this right now in front of millions of people, but you could make the argument that refined carbohydrates, let's just think a donut, some sort of refined sugary treat like that is not going to love you back. And I would say it pretty much for anybody, it's not going to be great in excess versus some processed meats. And that phrase processed meats is kind of a loose term as well, right? I mean, how processed is processed, and we're lumping things all together when we're talking about processed meats. That there are better for you, quote unquote, processed meats if they're organic, if they're being third-party tested, if they're using better for you ingredients. They still are processed, but they're better. So it's not my go-to. I don't want you to have every meal filled with that.
Yeah.
But for me to make a blanket statement, say you can't have any processed foods. Well, there's a lot of healthy foods that are more convenient for people, that are boxed and packaged, and more convenient for people that are classified as processed. But when you look at the context and the ingredients, it's not the end of the world if you're having it here and there.
Can you give me some examples?
Well, bacon's a good example. I mean, I love bacon too, and it's not because I love bacon that I'm saying this, but there are organic, pasture-raised bacon that could very well be classified as quote unquote processed. And I would argue that it shouldn't be the foundation of your meals, but it's not something that I would say is off protocol for my average telehealth patient.
Okay.
Now, there are
I think you just got more patients there. People just signed up.
But you know what? And so there's that term ultra processed. Certainly, there's a lot of ultra processed junk that I wouldn't advocate for. But look, if you go to Expo West, I'm sure you've been there like that. You go to Anaheim every year. You look at the Natural Food Expo. There's lots of foods there that would be classified as ultra processed. But you look at the ingredients and they're better for you options. So for me to make blanket statements about everything there, I think is too oversimplistic and reductive. But and also there's a genetic component. There are some people that have ApoE44 and many other gene variants, but that's one gene variant that I do look at. And it's determining in part how fast or how slow your body transports saturated fats. So there are some people that should theoretically look at the amount of saturated fat, even the higher quality saturated fat. And my advice for them would be to diversify the types of healthy fats that they're having. And it's not demonizing saturated fat. I just don't want 80% of the fat you're consuming to be saturated fat. But we aren't just our genes. And you know that more
Yeah.
than the average person. The genetics aren't your destiny. They're just a variable. So interestingly, I see people that have ApoE44, this gene that's associated with increased likelihood of heart attack and stroke and Alzheimer's, and their other markers are completely fine. So for me to oversimplify even that and say, well, because you have that gene variant, you can't have saturated fat. There's a lot of other variables. It's like that crude analogy, but genetics loads the gun, epigenetics pulls the trigger. So we are realizing that even with this gene variant, there is a lot of evidence to show it can increase your likelihood of heart attack and stroke and Alzheimer's, but you cannot run with and say, well, because you have that gene, you're going to get it and you can't avoid it, because there's environmental factors that determine the expression of that gene.
Yeah. Well, that also reminds me a little bit of the part in the doc where Mayor Adams of New York was talking about how he went to the hospital and was very ill, and they diagnosed him with type 2 diabetes. And he said that, they handed him pamphlets that said living with diabetes. And he was like, yeah, no, that's not going to happen. And his endocrinologist told him it was impossible to reverse it. Meanwhile, I'm sitting there listening. I'm like, it's 2024. Everyone knows type 2 is reversible. What doctor did you go to? And
Yeah.
then he devoted himself to a plant-based diet, reversed the diabetes, sent the book that he used to the endocrinologist, and literally her quote was, I was in medical school for so many years, and it's unbelievable I was never taught this.
Yeah.
And I'm like, it's 2024, and your doctor, who's an endocrinologist in New York City, didn't know you could reverse this by cleaning out your diet. That's like
Yeah.
unfathomable to me.
Yeah. It is insane that we can live in such an age where, but it's, and I think we've come so far over the past, and we have, but I think what that shows is that we're really just scraping the surface on awareness, education, and there's one study came out a few years ago. It looked at medical doctor training, right, in conventional medical schools, and the study found that the average medical doctor it was a pediatric medical journal, found the average medical doctor would fail a basic nutrition test. It was like
Yeah.
24 questions or something like that. So it's just the training is not there. They're trained to diagnose a disease and match it with the medication.
Yep.
Now, there's lots of medical doctors, conventionally trained medical doctors, most of my colleagues, that then do postdoctorate training in functional medicine. That's most the Institute for Functional Medicine. That's where the Cleveland Clinic's Functional Medicine Center. That's who's trained myself and my team. Most of them are MDs, but they've had to seek out on their own because they were not taught this in school, and they had to learn this afterwards. It's just insane to me when you look at this. When the most of the chronic diseases that they're going to see in their primary care or endocrinology clinic is driven by lifestyle. So it's the height of irony to then ignore this major variable, which I know, you and I speak the same language on this. It's just, why aren't we looking at these lower cost, effective root cause variables here? But even beyond the training, like you said, the endocrinologist, even if they weren't trained in this, they've not heard this to be a possibility. Even if you didn't know,
Yeah.
I had many of my patients, what their conventional doctors will say, they'll say, they don't understand it, but they'll say, whatever you're doing, keep on doing it, because they don't necessarily understand it, but they see the labs. The labs aren't lying, and the data is showing, itself. I got the same back in the day, like 14, 15 years ago when I started in this, is I would get a hate mail, and I would get voice messages saying, how dare you say that you could reverse type 2 diabetes? You are giving people false hope. You are spreading lies. Now I agree that it's a lot more common knowledge, not apparently in New York and endocrinology office, but
In 2024. I mean, listen, I got type 1 and I was like, F you, I'm reversing this. And in a sense, I did because I got off all insulin, but that's not really heard of. And so I think I always think anything is possible. And my thing, I was just leaving a voice message for a friend who they think has colon cancer. And I said, well, they thought that the stuff in my liver was cancer. So you cannot just listen to anything they say. You have to get multiple opinions. You have to like investigate in another way. You can't just hand it over to just anybody.
Mhm.
I had another friend whose dad got what they said was a brain tumor, and they wanted to do all these things, spinal taps and brain biopsies and whatever. And at a massive institution, my doctor wasn't available until later, and he went and saw someone else. And I sat in on the call, and I didn't like how he was talking. It was just kind of like literally like this was just a number in his portfolio. Yeah, this is it, and we're gonna do this. And I was like, yeah, that doesn't feel good. But wanted to do all the same things. We get to my neurosurgeon. He's like, and this is somebody with the most experience, the best in the country. He goes, I don't know what I'm seeing, but I'm thinking it looks more like inflammation or an autoimmune condition. Now, guess what? If you had listened to the first guy, you would have biopsied your brain, you would have done all these things. Now there's a whole different approach potentially. You have to keep pushing. You have to keep asking. So I left a voice message for my friend. I said, please don't be committed to any disease or any thought that they have. Be committed to possibility, because anything is possible at any time. You just have to believe. And listen, at the end of the day, we don't know what's in the cards overall for us, but you gotta at least lead that way, in my opinion, and do what you can to make sure you have the right diagnosis.
Oh, absolutely. And when we hear the concept, or we use the jargon of placebo effect, and we see it as something negative, I think it's something so fascinating and just something I want more people should be
Precious.
aware of. It's mind over matter. It's how does thought, how does belief influence your health? And conversely, as there is a placebo effect, there is the nocebo effect of as negative things. There's one study I'm aware of where the gentleman was diagnosed with cancer, said he had X amount of months to live, and he very rapidly deteriorated and died. And then when the autopsy was done, they found no cancer. It was the belief that he was
Oh,
dying. So we have to
unbelievable.
realize that as that can happen, so can belief. Like you said, can you believe in the possibility instead of being identified with this label, which it's so easily done, especially with some heavy diagnoses like autoimmune, cancer, heart disease. You own that in your cells,
Mm-hmm.
and then that determines a lot of outcome, which a lot of people don't have that natural resilience and fortitude that you have, that I think it's been a massive testament to your healing over and over again. That most people get rattled and get thrown, and they believe it on a deep cellular level, and it's part of what makes them decline.
Yeah, thank you. I always say it doesn't mean I don't get rattled and thrown. I do. It's just how long I stay there.
Right.
And I think that that's something that we all have to help each other with, is like, how long are you going to stay there? How long are you going to keep, worrying? And I had a
Right.
therapist and a guest, actually, I found out later, that said, choose wonder over worry. And once I
Mm.
started applying that technique that I had learned here, is why I say the show saves my life all the time. Choose wonder over worry. I wonder what it's going to be like when the doctor calls me next with good news. And he did.
Mm.
I wonder what it's going to be like when I get to the other side of surgery and everything's great and I welcome my baby daughter into this world. And it happened. And so all we can do is control us and our response. It's not easy. But if you can do it, you will have a better result. And so I think that is a really big part of this and in health. But it takes for you to get there, unfortunately, to even think about those things, because most of
Yeah.
us are just, even one of the women in the doc was talking about how she just never considered her health. She was just so busy with work. We have made work such a priority in our
Mhm.
lives that our health that's going to keep us at work or keep us being able to enjoy our lives and do all the things we want to do is literally not even a consideration. Forget last. It's not
Yeah.
even a
Well,
consideration.
yeah, it's the burnout. Burnout is a burnout culture. Burnout seen as a badge of honor. It's so true. And that stress part, right? It's so powerful, and it's something that, and stress will influence the foods that you eat too, right? It's so inextricably linked. But I mean, to talk about that documentary and the study behind it, I mean, the if I have a standard American eater, right? They're eating processed, refined foods, high carbohydrate, lots of processed meats and industrial seed oils like canola oil, vegetable oil, all things I would not recommend people to have. If they go to a standard vegan diet, you're going to see a lot of changes because
Of
you're going
course.
off of a lot of that processed foods. My take on this would be just because something's better than the standard American diet is it the most optimal long term? And I think that's where, from a sustainability standpoint, and also just key nutrient standpoint
Hmm.
too, that I think a strict vegan diet is missing something from a nutrient density and bioavailable nutrient density standpoint. And let me say this: I am a pragmatist. So clinically, with telehealth patients, there are people that, for religious reasons or ethical reasons, they are still vegan, and I want to make them the best, most nutrient dense, anti-inflammatory vegan diet possible for them, or vegetarian, whatever they are. But if I had my ideal, you know, wiggle room there with them, I would advocate to bring in some high quality meats. It doesn't have to be the foundation of your diet. For some people, it may for a time, actually, because a lot of people have reactions to a lot of these plant proteins as their gut is unhealthy. But over time, it should be a well balanced omnivore diet.
What are the key meats that you would like for people to do? If you had your dream patient, it's like these are the meats that I think are the best to incorporate for minerals and protein and iron and all of that.
Well, I would say wild caught fish is going to be up there. If I could
But
be,
so hard to find.
yeah, I know. And then, look, I don't want to be such a Debbie Downer and find the fault with everything, but microplastics are a problem with wild caught fish and beef. It's our entire food supply
It's a
is
shit
messed up.
show.
But you have to, because you could find the same thing with some plant foods with heavy metals and things. So you can't live in that fear bubble. I would just say the body is amazingly resilient. Do the best you can and then give the rest to God. Because you can find some obsessive, orthorexic reason to not have anything under the sun, which that's
Yeah.
antithetical to health. To stress about eating healthy food is not good. So you high quality fish, do the best you can. Grass-fed beef, do the best you can. And those would be my top picks. It's interesting, this study, the JAMA study that the Netflix documentary was made on, most of the meat that the omnivores ate was chicken, which isn't actually my highest choice, because it's not high in a lot of these fat soluble vitamins. It's not high in healthy fats, and it's high in actually polyunsaturated fatty acids, if anything, which is the modern American diet's already high in a lot of polyunsaturated fatty acids, like industrial seed oils, canola oil, vegetable oil, and chicken is also high in these not industrial seed oils, but in polyunsaturated fatty acids from a whole food source. So my point being, we don't necessarily need more polyunsaturated fatty acids in the modern Western diet. We need more long chain omega fatty acids, namely from fish and grass-fed beef. And what I would say is good quality saturated fats from high quality sources for cellular health, brain health, cholesterol, hormones. And we need monounsaturated fats like avocados, olives, and things like that.
So what about like lamb and pork?
I would put lamb higher, closer to grass-fed beef, honestly. And pork, I would put right under grass-fed beef. It's not that people can't have it, but from a nutrient density standpoint, it's not as impressive when you look at
Hmm.
the vitamins and minerals and fatty acid profile that grass-fed beef and wild-caught fish
Is
has. But people
turkey,
can have it if they want.
what about
Turkey would
turkey
be
versus
closer to
chicken?
It's about the same
Yeah.
to me. I don't see a massive difference. I mean, the darker meats probably are going to have a higher, different array of vitamins, minerals, and fatty acids that you could make an argument to have more dark meat. But generally speaking, they're kind of under the same umbrella for me. It's people can have it. I don't think it should be the majority of the meat that they're having.
Yeah. I cut chicken after watching how they kill them at a Tony Robbins seminar for his health day. I literally watched this
Tony will get
video.
you with that.
Did you see it?
No, I have seen videos like that, but not at Tony Robbins event.
Oh my God, Will. I literally looked up, was so horrified. I started crying. I said, I will never eat chicken again. I actually quit meat altogether that year for a year, and my anemia was so bad I had to go back on red meat. But I stayed off chicken. And funny enough, within, I don't know, 2 or 3 years, when I was checking my thyroid nodules at the time, they had all disappeared. And the only
Wow.
thing I had stopped was the chicken, which makes sense. Maybe all those hormones they feed them,
Yeah.
maybe me getting less of that helped. But I want to ask you, because don't they feed chicken corn?
Yeah,
And
they do.
isn't corn horrible for us? And isn't that just what the chicken is made of if that's all it's eating?
Corn and soy protein, because chickens are naturally meant to graze, right? They're eating bugs out there. So when you see pasture raised chicken, now we could maybe break down some of this jargon on the boxes of meats and eggs and things like that. But the more pasture raised, free range chicken, that the more they're foraging around eating bugs, the better their profile is going to be. And the proteins that are in soy and corn, if the person has a problem with corn and soy, now context here, I deal a lot with people that have autoimmune problems and digestive problems. They have food sensitivities. I've seen time and time again, people have reactions to the corn and soy fed chickens and their eggs when they eat eggs, and they think, oh my gosh, I can't have eggs. But when they get the pasture raised eggs, they're fine. And there's a lot of variables there. Is it the corn and the soy? Is it some other variable? Who knows? But I would say, yeah, certainly when you look at corn and soy, which we know both of those are genetically modified unless it's organic and sprayed with all types of stuff, that's going into our food supply. That's going into the meat or the egg that you are then consuming. So it's one variable to consider. Back to my earlier point, is it the food or is it what we've done to the food,
Mhm.
which is large? It's just an environmental topic. I mean, this is an environmental issue when you look at our food supply and how it's impacting our gut microbiome, which is intimately connected to the soil microbiome and what these herbicides and pesticides are doing.
Well, that's another thing they talk about in the doc, and that is how the cattle situation is contributing. It's the highest emission of gases in the world, and by far the U.S. is the biggest culprit. And just seeing, I mean, oh gosh, there was another food documentary years ago I watched that was just mind blowing too. But just seeing, the waste ponds that they have and how they're spraying it into the air and just, I mean, even the poor animals, like the cows, like 96% of them are raised in these industrial beef lots. They never leave their little stall. They just gorge on food. It makes me so sad. I feel horrible that I eat red
Yeah.
meat, and I had the willpower to quit. I just couldn't get past the anemia.
Mhm.
And
Well, I think
so,
that's the place for that sort of third way. And I think that's where vegans and people within the functional medicine space, not to say that, I mean, there's a lot of vegans in functional medicine, but I would say what I would call the regenerative farming group within wellness, which I would be a part of that group, where we can come together with vegans. And what do we have in common is that CAFO industrial farming is not healthy for the environment or our health, which is one and the same.
explain what
But
CAFO is.
they're the industrial feedlots that you mentioned. They're the cows or the pigs or the chickens living in very inhumane conditions. Some of them don't even see sunlight. They are very crammed. They are in feces. They are because of their unhealthy living conditions, having to be fed and given antibiotics because they'll get diseases from these inhumane conditions. So nobody within our space is going to say that's good. But that sort of either or approach, it's either CAFO or vegan. That's the binary reductive takeaway. Is there a third way? And I think that the regenerative farming movement is really the way to look at it, because from an environmental standpoint, it's very effective, and from a food quality standpoint, it's very effective. So it's to me, that's the path towards not only healing our planet,
Mm-hmm.
because you could look at mono crops with vegan foods. I mean, corn and soy is in most vegan foods. That's contributing to the environmental issue as well. So
Or
it's
you
not
mean like
just
the packaged vegan foods?
packaged vegan foods that's using corn and soy.
Yeah.
So this is not the same as organic ancient grain corn. I'm not talking about that. Or I'm not talking about organic fermented soy from small farms. I'm not talking about that. But the majority of soy and corn that the average vegan is consuming is part of that same whole industrial farming industry that they're railing against when it comes to beef. So we have to be part of a better food sourcing movement, which the regenerative farming movement and other sort of tangential industries that are in the organic world that aren't interested in these monocultures, monocrops like corn and soy, we're talking more about, and we're educating and empowering people to make better choices with their dollar.
Yeah. I'll tell you, when there was that time where I was not eating meat, I was getting Impossible Burgers, or I was going into that like vegan section and grabbing stuff. I was going into, there was a chain of like vegan food. I can't remember, like a vegan fast food chain or whatever. And at some point I looked at myself and I'm like, all this stuff, I don't know what any of these ingredients mean either. So, how could this be good for me? And
Yeah,
realize that I just have to abandon all the packages altogether and
yeah,
just eat real everything and, keep it in moderation. And I think when you were talking about kind of, finding a new way, I go back to an interview I did with Alicia Silverstone like 15 years ago, probably, where she wrote her book, her vegan book. And she talked about becoming an aspiring vegetarian, where if you just ate less meat, you would take down the environmental load and obviously, do better. And I was like, okay, I think that's where I can land. And so I think that eating less is good, because when you think about it, we're really being promoted to eat more meat and dairy by those industries, right?
mhm. Yeah, from the meat industry, certainly. And I would say on the flip side, we're being pushed towards an agenda of having more fake meat and industrial seed oils and foods like that from certain special interests as well. So you're right that you have to follow the money with these messages. Um, I feel like when you look at documentaries like that on Netflix and the media around it and the money behind these food tech companies like Beyond and Impossible, there's a lot of push to have these vegan foods in the name of environmentalism, but it's problematic, the quality of the ingredients, and they don't really discuss this third way, this regenerative farming way,
Hmm.
which I would say does a lot. The science shows it does a lot to sequester carbon and improve environmental. Now, you could make the argument, yes, it's more expensive. People don't always have access to regenerative farm foods. I get that. I get that. So there's limitations in what's possible for the average
Hmm.
person, but we need to at least include it in the conversation and as an option for many people. And yeah, so that's kind of my take on it.
All right, friends, thank you for being with us. If you love this episode, please share it with your friends, leave us a review, all of the above. In the meantime, most importantly, do not forget to come back tomorrow for part 2, where we're going to dive into foods that love you back and how to kind of look at things a little bit nicer for yourself, orthorexia, and where to get regenerative meat. You're going to be so surprised that it's so much easier than you thought, coming up tomorrow. In the meantime, be nice people, make good choices, and be present.
This podcast and all related content published or distributed by or on behalf of Maria Menounos or mariamenounos.com is for informational purposes only and may include information that is general in nature and that is not specific to you. Any information or opinions expressed or contained herein are not intended to serve as or replace medical advice, nor to diagnose, prescribe, or treat any disease, condition, illness, or injury, and you should consult the healthcare professional of your choice regarding all matters concerning your health, including before beginning any exercise, weight loss, or healthcare program. If you have or suspect you may have a healthcare emergency, please contact a qualified healthcare professional for treatment. Any information or opinions provided by a guest expert or host featured within website or on company's podcast are their own, not those of Maria Menounos or the company. Accordingly, Maria Menounos and the company cannot be responsible for any results or consequences or actions you may take based on information or opinions.